Imagine a family whose name would one day become linked with enormous wealth, famous faces, private islands, and front-page headlines, yet whose story began in fear, loss, and uncertainty. The Onassis family story is not simply about money. It is about survival, ambition, and the emotional cost of living a life where everything is watched and judged. At the center of this story stands Aristotle Socrates Onassis, a man whose childhood shaped his hunger for power and security. He was born in 1906 in Smyrna, a busy port city on the Aegean coast, known today as Izmir, Turkey. At the time, Smyrna was one of the most colorful and wealthy cities in the region. Greeks, Turks, Armenians, Europeans, and traders from across the Mediterranean lived and worked side by side. Ships arrived daily, carrying goods, news, and opportunity. For a young boy growing up in this environment, the sea was not just water, it was a promise. Aristotle's father, Socrates Onassis, was a tobacco merchant. Tobacco was one of Smyrna's most valuable products, shipped across Europe and beyond. The family lived comfortably, and young Aristotle grew up watching business deals happen around him. He saw how money moved, how ships connected countries, and how fortunes could rise and fall. But this comfort was fragile. Smyrna sat in a politically unstable region, and when the Greco-Turkish War reached its violent end in 1922, everything collapsed. The city was set on fire, thousands were killed, and entire communities were forced to flee. The Onassis family became refugees overnight. Their home, business, and sense of safety vanished. For Aristotle, this moment left a deep scar. One day he was part of a respected family, and the next he was a displaced teenager with no country and no certainty about the future. This experience planted a powerful fear inside him, the fear of ever being powerless again. Aristotle became determined to build a life so strong that no war, no government, and no disaster could ever take it away. That determination pushed him far from his homeland. At just 17 years old, he boarded a ship to Buenos Aires, Argentina. He arrived with little money and few connections, but with a sharp mind and an intense drive. His early jobs were small, including work as a telephone operator. But he listened closely to the voices of businessmen and diplomats. He learned how wealthy people spoke, how deals were made, and how power worked behind closed doors. These lessons, learned quietly and patiently, would later shape one of the greatest business empires of the 20th century. Buenos Aires in the 1920s was full of opportunity. Argentina was rich from agriculture and trade, and immigrants from Europe filled the city with energy and ambition. Aristotle Onassis used this environment to his advantage. He started small, returning to what he knew best: tobacco. By blending local tobacco with familiar Greek flavors, he created products that appealed to Greek immigrants who missed home. This was more than a business idea. It showed his ability to understand emotion and memory, and to turn them into profit. Slowly, he built capital and confidence. But Aristotle's dreams reached far beyond cigarettes. He had grown up watching ships, and he believed the future of true power lived on the sea. During the 1930s and 1940s, global trade was changing. Oil was becoming the most valuable resource in the world, and those who controlled its movement would control enormous wealth. Aristotle Onassis saw this before many others did. While traditional shipping companies focused on old methods, he invested in oil tankers. He bought ships cheaply, often when others were afraid to take risks. He used clever legal structures, registering ships under different national flags, to reduce costs and avoid restrictions. These strategies were controversial, but they worked. Within a few decades, Onassis controlled one of the largest private shipping fleets in the world. With wealth came visibility. Aristotle no longer lived quietly. He bought luxury homes, private islands like Scorpios, and the famous yacht Christina O, which became a floating symbol of power. Politicians, movie stars, royalty, and world leaders were invited aboard. Onassis understood image as well as business. His lifestyle was carefully displayed, sending a message that he had risen from nothing and now stood among the most powerful people on earth. But beneath the glamour, his need for control never faded. Wealth was still armor, protecting him from the fear rooted in his refugee past. This period also marked the beginning of intense public attention. Aristotle's personal life became as famous as his business success. His relationships, rivalries, and conflicts were reported around the world. He was admired, criticized, and feared. To some, he was a genius businessman. To others, he was ruthless and manipulative. But no one could ignore him. The Onassis name had become global, representing both extraordinary success and constant controversy. Yet as his empire grew stronger, cracks quietly began to form within his family, setting the stage for future tragedy. Despite all his wealth, Aristotle Onassis struggled to find peace in his personal life. He married Athena Tina Livanos, a woman from another powerful shipping family, and together they had 2 children, Alexander and Christina. To the outside world, the family appeared perfect, rich, beautiful, and untouchable. But inside, there was tension. Aristotle was demanding and often distant. His hunger for success left little room for emotional closeness. His relationships outside his marriage, including his famous affair and later marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy, brought global attention but deepened personal divisions. The greatest tragedy came with the death of his son, Alexander Onassis, in 1973. Alexander died in a plane crash at just 24 years old. This loss broke Aristotle in a way no financial loss ever could. Alexander was not just his son, he was the future of the Onassis Empire. After his death, Aristotle's health declined rapidly. The powerful man who once controlled ships and governments was now overwhelmed by grief. He died in 1975, leaving behind an empire without its driving force. Christina Onassis inherited enormous wealth, but also immense emotional pain. She struggled throughout her life with loneliness, failed marriages, and trust issues. Money could buy comfort, but it could not replace family or stability. Christina died in 1988 at the age of 37, alone in a hotel room. With her death, much of the Onassis fortune passed to her daughter Athena, who grew up largely away from the spotlight, protected from the fame that had damaged earlier generations. The story of the Onassis family is a reminder that wealth does not protect against tragedy. Their empire was built on ambition and survival, but it carried the emotional wounds of loss, fear, and pressure. From the burning streets of Smyrna to the quiet rooms where family members faced their darkest moments, the Onassis story is both inspiring and heartbreaking. It shows how greatness can rise from suffering, but also how the cost of that rise can echo through generations. In the end, the Onassis name remains unforgettable not only for its riches, but for the human story hidden behind the luxury. Oil was becoming the lifeblood of the modern world, quietly shaping the future of nations, cities, and industries. Cars were spreading across roads. Airplanes were beginning to shrink distances, and factories depended on steady power to keep machines alive. But oil meant nothing if it could not move. Pipelines were limited, rail transport was slow and expensive, and the real future lay across the oceans. This was something Aristotle Onassis understood before most others did. Long before his name became linked with luxury yachts, famous marriages, and global headlines, Onassis was simply a young Greek immigrant with sharp eyes and relentless ambition. Born into a world already unstable, he learned early that security was fragile, and opportunity favored those willing to act when others hesitated. When he arrived in Buenos Aires in the early 1920s, the city was full of noise and promise. Cafes buzzed with conversation, smoke floated under warm lights, and immigrants from across the world chased new beginnings. Onassis had little money, but he carried himself with confidence that made people notice. He dressed carefully, spoke with charm, and listened more than he talked. Even then, he understood that business was not just about numbers, but about presence, timing, and perception. His first success came from tobacco trading, a modest start that gave him his first taste of independence. But Onassis was not interested in comfort. He wanted scale, power, and reach. His attention soon turned to the sea. Shipping at the time was an old industry controlled by traditional families who valued caution and tradition over risk. Most of them operated as they always had, slowly and predictably, trusting that the old ways would continue to protect them. Onassis saw something different. He saw that oil demand would only grow, and that whoever controlled transport would control profit. In the late 1920s, he made what looked like an unremarkable move. He bought 2 old freighters, ships so worn that established companies would have scrapped them. They were cheap, rusty, and far from impressive. To many, it looked like a poor man's gamble. But Onassis understood a simple truth. The sea does not care how old a ship is, only whether it floats and carries cargo. He ran those ships with strict cost control, cutting waste, negotiating hard, and keeping operations lean. While others avoided risk, he leaned into it. Then came the Great Depression, a time when fortunes collapsed and fear ruled markets. Most wealthy men pulled back, protecting what they had left. Onassis did the opposite. As ships flooded the market at a fraction of their true value, he bought aggressively. Where others saw disaster, he saw opportunity. It was like a chess player giving up small pieces to win the board. One by one, he expanded his fleet, building capacity while competitors froze. This habit of buying when others fled became one of his lifelong strategies. But his real breakthrough came with oil tankers. In the 1930s, oil shipping was still developing, and few fully understood the power of scale. Onassis realized that the larger the tanker, the cheaper it was to move each barrel of oil. Bigger ships meant lower costs and higher profit margins. He began commissioning tankers larger than industry standards, betting his future on the belief that global oil demand would explode. It was a bold move, and many thought it reckless. But history proved him right. As the world moved closer to war and industrial expansion accelerated, oil became essential. Onassis's massive tankers turned into floating gold mines, attracting long-term contracts from oil companies that valued efficiency above tradition. He did not stop there. Shipping at the time was tightly controlled by national laws, heavy taxes, and strict labor rules, especially in countries like Britain and Greece. Onassis found a way around this system by registering his ships under flags of convenience, first in Panama and later in Liberia. This allowed him to avoid high taxes and regulations, cutting costs dramatically. Old shipping families criticized him, calling his methods dishonorable, but results spoke louder than words. His profits grew, and soon those same critics quietly copied his approach. Onassis also understood that true power required political access. He negotiated directly with governments, bypassing traditional business channels. In one famous case, he secured a deal with Saudi Arabia for exclusive oil transport rights, a move so bold it alarmed major oil companies. Though the deal was later challenged, it revealed his mindset. Onassis did not want small contracts. He wanted dominance. He walked into palaces and offices with confidence, using charm, persistence, and nerve to win agreements others would not even attempt. By the time World War II reshaped the world, Onassis had already positioned himself ahead of the curve. The war destroyed ships and disrupted trade, but it also created massive demand afterward. Europe needed rebuilding, and everything required transport. Onassis moved fast again, buying surplus Liberty ships from the United States, and converting them for commercial use. While competitors debated, he acted. By the early 1950s, Aristotle Onassis controlled one of the largest private shipping fleets on Earth. His tankers powered cities, industries, and nations. He had turned chaos, displacement, and crisis into stepping stones. Like a modern immigrant building a global tech empire from failing startups, Onassis built his fortune from steel, oil, and oceans. His ships were not just tools of trade, they were symbols of power. Massive hulls and crowded ports announced his presence without a word spoken. Nations depended on the routes he controlled. History itself moved across the decks of his vessels. This mastery of the sea laid the foundation for everything that followed: the mansions, the yachts, the fame, and the relationships that would later dominate headlines. Yet even as his empire rose, unseen cracks were forming. Onassis had mastered business, risk, and image, but there were forces he could not control. The same hunger that built his empire would one day demand a heavy price, not in money, but in family, loss, and tragedy. For now, though, Aristotle Onassis stood at the peak of his rise, a man who had bent history to his will, unaware that fate was quietly preparing its reply. By the mid-1950s, Aristotle Onassis was no longer just a shipping tycoon operating quietly behind the scenes of global trade. He had become a public figure, a symbol of modern wealth in a world still recovering from war. His ships moved oil, grain, and steel across oceans. But Onassis himself began to move through a different kind of current, one filled with celebrities, politicians, and royalty. Money had given him access, but image gave him influence. He understood that power was not only measured in contracts and fleets, but in visibility. Onassis began to craft a life that looked as large as his empire. He bought mansions in Europe, New York, and Greece, each one designed to impress and intimidate. But his greatest symbol was the yacht Christina, named after his daughter. It was not simply a boat, but a floating palace, filled with marble, gold fixtures, and luxury beyond imagination. World leaders, movie stars, and aristocrats gathered on its decks, drinking champagne while the sea carried them forward. Onassis believed that hosting the powerful was as important as negotiating with them. Deals were made over dinners, alliances formed under the sun, and reputations shaped by proximity. At the center of this world stood Onassis himself, confident, sharp, and always in control. Yet behind the polished image was a complicated family life. He married Tina Livanos, the daughter of another wealthy shipping family, a union that seemed perfect on paper. Together, they had 2 children, Alexander and Christina. From the outside, it looked like a dynasty in the making. But Onassis was a man who struggled with balance. His ambition consumed him, and his affairs became legendary. He treated love much like business, intense, competitive, and often careless. Tina eventually left him, unable to endure his constant infidelity. Their separation marked the first major fracture in the family. Despite his wealth, Onassis proved unable to build a stable home. He adored his children, but often expressed affection through money rather than time. Alexander, his son, was groomed as heir to the empire, but he was sensitive and restless, living under the shadow of an enormous name. Christina, strong-willed and emotional, sought approval in a world that rarely gave it freely. As Onassis's fame grew, so did his appetite for attention. This hunger reached its peak when he entered the orbit of Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of American President John F. Kennedy. Jackie was one of the most famous women in the world, admired for her elegance and strength after tragedy. When Onassis married her in 1968, the world was stunned. The union shocked American society, fascinated the media, and cemented Onassis as a global icon beyond business. To Onassis, the marriage represented more than love. It was validation. He had risen from a penniless immigrant to the husband of America's most admired woman. Yet the marriage was deeply misunderstood. Jackie sought protection and stability after loss, while Onassis sought legacy and image. Their worlds never fully merged. Jackie preferred privacy and distance, while Onassis thrived on spectacle. Their relationship was marked by separation, misunderstanding, and quiet loneliness. Even surrounded by wealth, both lived emotionally isolated lives. Meanwhile, cracks within the family widened. Alexander struggled to find his place. Though intelligent and capable, he felt trapped between his father's expectations and his own desires. Onassis pushed him toward business, but Alexander was drawn to aviation and independence. Christina battled insecurity and emotional pain, turning to relationships that often ended in disappointment. Onassis, who could control oil markets and governments, found himself powerless within his own family. Tragedy struck in 1973 when Alexander died in a plane crash at the age of 24. The loss shattered Onassis completely. Friends said the powerful tycoon aged overnight. He blamed himself, believing that pushing his son into aviation had led to his death. The empire that once energized him now felt meaningless. His health declined rapidly, and his once sharp presence dulled under grief. He withdrew from public life, spending long hours alone, often staring at the sea he once commanded. Christina was devastated by her brother's death, losing the one person who truly understood her. Jackie retreated further into her own world, emotionally distant from a husband broken by loss. The marriage quietly dissolved in spirit, even if it remained on paper. Onassis's final years were filled with regret. He had conquered markets, but failed to protect his family. In 1975, Aristotle Onassis died, leaving behind immense wealth and unresolved sorrow. Christina inherited much of the fortune, but money could not replace love or stability. She married multiple times, searching for connection, but pain followed her. In 1988, Christina died alone in a hotel room at the age of 37, officially ruled a heart attack, though many believed her heart had been broken long before. With her death, the direct Onassis line effectively ended. The empire survived on paper, but the family dream did not. The yachts, the mansions, and the ships remained, but the people they were meant to serve were gone. What began as a story of ambition and brilliance slowly transformed into one of loss and emptiness. The Onassis name, once a symbol of unstoppable rise, became a reminder that wealth can build empires but cannot protect against fate. Power may command oceans, but it cannot heal grief. And so the family that once stood at the center of global attention faded quietly into history, leaving behind a lesson as old as time. Success without balance carries a price, and sometimes the cost is everything. The final chapter of the Onassis family story is one of tragedy, loss, and the sharp contrast between wealth and happiness. Aristotle Onassis had built a world empire, commanding oceans, oil, and global attention. Yet the very things he valued most, family, love, and stability, eluded him. After his death in 1975, the glimmering empire he left behind could not shield those he loved from suffering. His daughter Christina, once the bright young heir of unimaginable fortune, became the central figure of this final tragedy. She inherited not just the wealth of her father, but the weight of expectations, the ghosts of loss, and the invisible scars of a childhood overshadowed by ambition and absence. From an early age, Christina had lived under the constant scrutiny of the public and the intense shadow of her father's fame. She was celebrated, admired, and envied, yet her life was profoundly lonely. While her father had pursued power and spectacle, Christina craved connection and warmth, things the Onassis fortune could not provide. The death of her brother Alexander, who had been both her confidant and anchor, left an emptiness that no amount of money could fill. Alexander's loss was a blow to the family and to the legacy of Onassis's empire. Friends and employees noted how the tycoon himself seemed to collapse emotionally after his son's death, and though he had accumulated unmatched wealth, he could not undo what grief had wrought. This loss set a pattern for Christina's own life. As she grew, her attempts to find companionship and love were often overshadowed by the weight of the family name. She married multiple times, but happiness remained elusive. Even surrounded by luxury yachts, sprawling mansions, and treasures beyond measure, Christina experienced isolation, betrayal, and profound sadness. Her life became a cautionary tale, showing that power and money cannot replace the essential human needs for love, support, and security. The media followed her every move, chronicling her relationships, travels, and moments of despair, creating a public image of glamour that hid a private world of vulnerability and sorrow. In 1988, Christina died at the age of 37, alone in a hotel room. The official cause was a heart attack, yet many believed her heart had carried the weight of her family's tragedies for decades. Her death symbolized the culmination of a family saga that had begun with an ambitious immigrant crossing oceans with little more than vision and determination. The Onassis fortune survived on paper. Ships still sailed, estates remained, and wealth endured. But the human connections that might have made it meaningful were gone. The empire that Aristotle Onassis had created, which once seemed unstoppable and immortal, became a silent monument to ambition, showing both its power and its peril. The story of the Onassis family reminds us that even the most extraordinary success carries hidden costs. Great fortune can command nations, influence politics, and dazzle the world, but it cannot shield loved ones from fate, tragedy, or the consequences of ambition untempered by balance and care. Aristotle Onassis's life was legendary, filled with risk, genius, and audacity. But the price of that life was measured not in dollars or ships, but in heartbreak, broken families, and lives lost too soon. Christina's death marked the tragic end of the direct Onassis lineage, and with it, the public was forced to reflect on the limitations of wealth. The mansions, yachts, and luxury that once symbolized power now seemed empty, without love, connection, and family to give them purpose. Historians and biographers often marvel at Onassis's accomplishments, describing him as one of the most brilliant businessmen of the 20th century, a man who saw opportunity where others saw risk, who commanded oceans, and who negotiated with kings. Yet equally important is the lesson of the Onassis family saga, that vision, hunger, and intelligence can build empires, but they cannot protect against mortality, human frailty, or the fragile bonds that tie families together. Today, the Onassis name remains known around the world, associated with daring, luxury, and influence, but the private stories behind that name tell of ambition that soared as high as the sky, only to meet tragedy on the ground. The rise and fall of the Onassis family serves as a timeless narrative, blending awe and sorrow, power and vulnerability, triumph and loss. It teaches that while wealth can create opportunity, spectacle, and fame, it cannot create happiness on its own. Love, care, and presence, elements that money cannot buy, are what give life its true meaning. The story of Aristotle Onassis, his children, and his family is thus not only a tale of shipping and oil, of yachts and palaces, but also a deeply human story about ambition, isolation, and the limits of control. His ships carried oil that fueled nations, but they could not carry the family from suffering. His yachts hosted kings, celebrities, and presidents, but they could not host the love and warmth Christina needed. And in the end, the glittering empire that seemed eternal was a reminder that while ambition can move the world, the heart remains fragile, vulnerable, and ultimately beyond the reach of even the greatest fortune. The Onassis family story ends not with wealth or power, but with reflection, grief, and the quiet understanding that all human stories, no matter how grand, must contend with loss. It is a story that blends the extraordinary and the tragic, leaving behind a legacy as much of caution as of admiration, a legacy that reminds us that ambition, success, and fame are powerful, but without love, balance, and connection, they are never enough. Aristotle Onassis was born into modest circumstances in Smyrna, in what is now modern-day Turkey. His family faced hardship during the Greco-Turkish War, and like many others, they were forced to flee their homeland. Young Aristotle witnessed the fragility of life and the precariousness of fortune, lessons that would shape his entire existence. Determined not to be bound by circumstance, he moved to Argentina as a young man, carrying nothing but ambition, intelligence, and a burning desire to succeed. Starting with small jobs, from working in tobacco stores to assisting in shipping operations, Onassis quickly learned the value of hard work, shrewd observation, and bold decision-making. He noticed opportunities where others saw obstacles, and he was never afraid to take calculated risks. By the time he was in his 20s, he had begun to acquire small ships, gradually building a fleet that would form the foundation of his future empire. Aristotle was not just focused on making money. He understood that wealth alone was not enough in a world where social standing, connections, and appearances mattered. He began cultivating relationships with influential figures in Buenos Aires, learning the delicate dance between influence, charm, and power. When he moved into shipping on a larger scale, he demonstrated an ability to think globally, purchasing vessels at opportune times, and strategically navigating the volatile world of international trade. His eye for profitable ventures, combined with relentless determination, allowed him to outmaneuver competitors and grow his fortune faster than many thought possible. Onassis's early success was driven by vision, courage, and a willingness to break rules that others considered sacred. But while his business acumen was impressive, it was his personality that truly set him apart. He had charisma, a sense of timing, and an understanding of spectacle. Wherever he went, people noticed him, not just for his wealth but for the energy and presence he brought into any room. Monaco became the perfect stage for his ambitions. This small, glamorous principality, a playground for royalty, financiers, and Hollywood stars, offered Aristotle a space to display both his wealth and his ingenuity. He invested in the Monte Carlo casino, creating opportunities to mingle with European aristocracy, while simultaneously expanding his business interests. Princes, dukes, and bankers were intrigued by the man who could arrive in a luxury car, host dazzling parties, and yet remain utterly independent of their centuries-old traditions. Onassis was different from the old money families who had inherited their wealth and prestige. He created his own identity, blending audacity with style, intelligence with charm, and business acumen with social mastery. His yachts became floating stages for high society, with the Mediterranean as his backdrop. The Christina O, named after his beloved daughter, would later become legendary for its grandeur and the parties it hosted. But even before that, Aristotle understood the power of spectacle. He blurred the lines between commerce and performance, turning business meetings into social events and transforming his public persona into an inseparable part of his strategy. The people who came into contact with Onassis did not merely remember the deals they struck. They remembered the experience of being in his presence. The sun sparkling on the Mediterranean, the clinking of champagne glasses, the laughter of guests, and the glamour of the evenings all became part of his legend. Even in those early years, Onassis demonstrated a keen sense of social intelligence. He understood that status could be elevated through associations, that the right companions could open doors even wealth alone could not. His connections with figures like opera singer Maria Callas or political icons such as Jacqueline Kennedy were not accidents. They were carefully cultivated relationships that allowed him to operate simultaneously in the worlds of finance, culture, and politics. He used charm, intelligence, and a flair for romance to solidify his position, ensuring that his rise was not only financial, but also social. But Onassis's path was never without challenges. Old money circles often viewed him as brash, too bold, and unrefined. Some whispered about the risks he took, the deals others considered reckless, and his tendency to operate in ways that pushed legal and social boundaries. And yet, this very audacity made him magnetic. Onassis did not conform. He reshaped the rules. While European aristocrats quietly presented their wealth for restrained estates, Onassis used extravagance as a tool, creating a lifestyle that was impossible to ignore. His homes, yachts, and public appearances were statements of his success, blending business acumen with theatricality. Newspapers chronicled not only his financial maneuvers, but also his social life, capturing the elegance and drama of a man who understood that perception could be as powerful as capital. Wealth alone would never have made Aristotle Onassis a legend. It was his ability to merge substance with spectacle, commerce with charisma, and vision with daring that ensured his place in history. From his early days in Buenos Aires to the glittering salons of Monaco, Aristotle Onassis was a man who refused to be ordinary, leaving an indelible mark on both business and high society. Aristotle Onassis's fascination with high society was not mere vanity. It was a deliberate strategy. He understood that influence often depended on who you were seen with, as much as the money you had in the bank. By surrounding himself with royalty, celebrities, and influential figures, he elevated his own status and created opportunities for both personal and professional gain. Monaco was central to this strategy. In this glamorous playground, Onassis built friendships with members of European nobility, including Prince Rainier, navigating the delicate balance of charm, negotiation, and performance that characterized his interactions with the elite. He treated social gatherings as carefully orchestrated events, blending business discussions with spectacle, ensuring that his presence was unforgettable. The Mediterranean became his stage, and his yachts, especially the Christina O, served as floating theaters where commerce, romance, and social maneuvering intertwined. Onassis's charm extended to the world of romance, where he developed relationships that were both passionate and strategic. His connection with Maria Callas, the famed opera diva, captured the world's imagination, merging glamour with intrigue. Later, his marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy, widow of U.S. President John F. Kennedy, placed him at the center of international attention, linking American political prestige with European aristocratic circles. Jacqueline's presence amplified the allure of the Onassis family, while Aristotle's wealth and charisma solidified his influence. But behind the glittering facade, there were challenges. High society was never fully accepting of Onassis. Whispers persisted that he was brash and unconventional, a man who made others uncomfortable by bending or ignoring rules. His business dealings were sometimes controversial, and he operated in a space that blurred the line between legal maneuvering and opportunism. Yet, these qualities, his audacity, his cunning, his refusal to be constrained by convention, were precisely what made him so effective. Onassis's homes were extensions of his personality and his strategy. Grosvenor Square in London, one of his most significant properties, became a hub of influence, elegance, and power. In this mansion, aristocrats, bankers, and international figures mingled with celebrities and political figures, creating a vibrant social ecosystem where alliances were formed, deals were struck, and influence expanded. Jacqueline Kennedy's presence elevated the household further, bringing a magnetic aura of history, resilience, and glamour. She and her sister, Lee Radziwill, created a social dynamic that blended American charm with European sophistication, turning the mansion into a stage where culture, politics, and society converged. Onassis understood the symbolic importance of these properties. They were not just homes, they were statements of legitimacy and permanence. After rising from modest beginnings, acquiring estates in historic neighborhoods was a visible declaration of success and power. Yet, despite the glamour, the Onassis family's life was not without tension and difficulty. The world of high society, while dazzling, was competitive and unforgiving. Maintaining influence required constant effort, and personal relationships were often entangled with social and business ambitions. The blend of public spectacle and private strategy defined much of Aristotle's life. Social gatherings, parties, and romantic connections were never purely personal. They were also instruments for consolidating influence, building networks, and reinforcing his position as a man who could not be ignored. His understanding of human psychology, the value of image, perception, and connections, was as critical to his empire as the shipping industry that created his wealth. Yet, for all the power and charm, tragedy was never far from the Onassis family. Life at the top was fragile, and personal losses would mark the family deeply. Alexander, Aristotle's only son, died young, shattering the family and leaving a void that could never be filled. Jacqueline, despite her elegance and resilience, faced constant scrutiny and the pressures of living in the public eye, enduring both admiration and criticism in equal measure. The Onassis family story is more than a tale of money or glamour. It is a human story of ambition, survival, and the cost of visibility. Aristotle's rise from refugee to shipping magnate showed what determination and vision could achieve. Christina's struggles revealed how wealth could magnify loneliness and heartbreak. Athena's life demonstrates a quieter form of legacy, one focused on personal freedom and resilience rather than spectacle. Together, their story reminds us that even immense wealth cannot shield us from human emotions, loss, or the consequences of choices made in the public eye. The Onassis name remains iconic, not just for yachts, islands, and fortune, but for the generations who lived, suffered, and persevered behind the headlines. Their story continues to fascinate because it captures the delicate balance between power, fame, and humanity. A timeless saga of rise, tragedy, and survival that resonates far beyond money and luxury.